In this session, we're going to look at questionnaire design. Many of you will develop questionnaires for your research proposal, and next year you may well use questionnaires in your projects. You also may come across questionnaires when you're reading papers. So how valid and reliable are the data from questionnaires? What kind of questions can you ask? What type of responses should be built in? How should you lay out a questionnaire? How should you evaluate pilot questionnaires? These are some of the issues that we're going to be looking at in this presentation. To be designed with only a modicum of knowledge about a subject. In these circumstances, mistakes are bound to occur unless the questionnaire is tested. For example, I had a PhD student looking at the topic of familial hypercholesterolemia, which was a topic he didn't know a great deal about. So he had to pilot and develop the questionnaire before he was ready to proceed with the final questionnaire. When you're testing a questionnaire, it should be designed in the medium that you're going to be using, for example, telephone interview, face-to-face, or internet. The number of interviews required to test the questionnaire could be as few as 5 to 10, although obviously more is better. But it has to be recognised that cost and time are constraints to questionnaire testing. A project may use semi-structured questionnaires with a very small number of interviews. Piloting here is a continuous process, and modifications can be made from the moment the study gets underway. When you're designing a questionnaire, it is essential to carefully consider the design and content so that you can extract meaningful information from the data. And designing a good questionnaire takes quite a lot of time and will require many drafts. You should also at this stage be thinking about how you're going to analyze the data. For example, what kind of statistical tests are you going to use? What comparisons are you going to make, etc. So thinking about piloting, let's have a quick review question. Piloting a questionnaire is a worthwhile exercise because it will, which of the following? Test out your questions on some of the people who will be in the final sample. Identify and amend any problems in the question wording, order, and format. Find out what a trained pilot would think of the subject matter, or all of the above. So which one of these is it? A, B, C, or D? So the answer to this question is B. Piloting a questionnaire is a worthwhile exercise because it will identify and amend any problems in the question wording, order, and format. A pilot study for a questionnaire will help to bring to light those questions that are defective for a variety of reasons and identify issues with their sequencing and also with instructions to respondents and interviewers. You should not test out your question on people who will be in the final sample because they will give biased answers later. So let's look at some examples of questionnaire design, and a good way of learning about questionnaires is to look at other questionnaires, and this is one that's been deliberately constructed so that you can learn from the errors in it. It's called the Appallingly Awful Palliative Care Questionnaire. There's a colon after awful, which doesn't really make any sense. The words terminally ill run together. It asks for a person's name, which is something that's unlikely that you would do. Question number 1. Do you have opinions on the best form of palliative care? You can see it's a closed response. It only allows yes or no, so probably not very informative. And then we have these categories for how long have you been a GP. So what's wrong with this? It asks for have you been a GP less than a year, 1 to 5 years, 5 to 15, or 15 or more. And what's wrong with this is that the categories overlap, so that if somebody's been a GP for 5 years, you wouldn't know which category to put them in. So the reference at the bottom is about features that are good and bad in questionnaire design, and it refers to a whole range of things which could cause problems in a questionnaire. For example, questions which don't quite mean what the researcher intended, questions which don't probe to find out what the respondent really meant, for example, in relation to opinions, questions which are inappropriate to the research topic, and so on. There are many aspects that you might want to consider here. Let's look at question 6. It states, please rank in order the most common reason you have for requesting admission of a patient to a hospice, and it lists 7 possible categories. Now, it's unlikely that you'll be able to recall 7 categories, and particularly which is the most common one. So in this situation, it'd be more usual to present people with a list having done some preparatory work in order for them to rank them. Questions 7 to 9 shown to here are asking about how satisfied you are with the service from, first of all, primary care team, second of all, hospice, and third of all, hospitals. And you can see that it has variations of the scales, but they're all different. The layout is very poor. So that's one problem. A second thing is they might, in nowhere in this questionnaire are there visual analog scales which are becoming more popular, something like this one. And here's an example from a particular paper. So that's one option that you might want to consider in questionnaire. So apart from these particular issues, also the point to think about what kind of information is it that you're trying to elicit. And broadly speaking, there are 2 broad categories. There are behavioral questions about the things that people do and the frequency with which they do them. And then secondly, there's attitudes towards things. I should also say that it's also useful to collect classification information. For instance, things like age, gender, social class, where they're working as a pharmacist, and so on. These are all things that might help you with the analysis, and quite often there are things that people don't think about putting in the questionnaire. Question 11 says, do you not agree that pharmacists should be part of the palliative care team? It's almost impossible to understand this question because of the use of the double negative, so that's something to be avoided. Question 12 states, in particular, what services and resources do you feel are lacking at present? It's not clear really what in particular relates to. It doesn't relate to the previous question. Question 13 asks people to recall information about how many people died in different categories. Again, it's unlikely that a person would have this information available readily to put into a questionnaire. Question 14 states, if you need help with patient symptom control, what sources of information or expertise do you use? Here we can see that the layout of the question is very poor. Question 15 states, how well do you get on with the hospital palliative care consultant? It's unlikely that you would ask for such sensitive information in a questionnaire. Question 16 says, are there any other relevant issues? But it doesn't leave any space to write in any answers. So you can see a whole range of issues regarding the questions asked on this page. Let's have a review question. An open question is one that A, can help to generate answers for closed questions, B, does not suggest or provide a limited range of responses, C, allows respondents to answer in their own words, or D, all of the above. So which one of those 4 options is it? So the answer to this question is all of the above. An open question is one which a respondent can answer any way they wish, while a closed question forces the respondents to choose from a fixed alternatives. All of the answers suggested for this question represent the advantages of open questions. Although quantitative researchers generally prefer closed questions for survey questionnaires, both types of questions are useful in research and will be used according to the type of data sought. Most demographic questions are closed, for example, like Likert scale questions. So we've been talking a little bit about open questions and closed questions. If we wanted to code answers to open questions, what would it be necessary to do? Would it be necessary to count the frequency with which each answer had been given? B, categorize unstructured material and assign a code number to each category. C, identify the 3 most common cited responses and give them a code. Or D, find out where each respondent lives and make a note of their postcode. So which is the answer to this question? The answer to this question is B. In order to postcode answers to open questions, it is necessary to categorize unstructured material and assign a code number to each category. Coding is an essential step in research so that data can be grouped into categories and the results compared. Coding can be done in advance for closed questions, often referred to as pre-coding. Post-coding, in contrast, is coding done after the data have been gathered. The frequency with which a particular answer is given is a straightforward computation exercise. In any event, can be catered for with pre-coding. However, the answers given to open questions can be quite varied and individualistic, so the first task is to categorize them according to research themes and then assign a number to each category so that quantitative analysis can be performed. This slide shows an example of a matrix question. On the left you have a number of questions shown here, and on the top you have a range of responses. Matrix questions are good for when you have several questions in a row with the same response options. For example, a series of questions with agree or disagree options, or a range of options ranging from very satisfied to very dissatisfied. A matrix is like a table. It groups together questions with the answer options labelled only once. Matrices can make questions quicker to read. However, be careful not to use matrices that are too large and require scrolling, which can be especially tricky on smartphones or tablets. So, as we've seen, there are many ways in which questions confuse or lead your responders to give you biased or inaccurate responses. Paying a little attention to questions and how they are worded can greatly improve your experience in research data collection. Let's look at some examples here. So question 1 asks, so that says, how many times have you used Adobe Acrobat during the last calendar year? It's going to be difficult to recall the actual number. Shortening the length of time to the last week may help. Question 2, when typing a letter, I typically use Word, Adobe Acrobat, Photoshop, or a word processors. This is an example of an ambiguous question because Word is also a word processor. Question 3, the Mac operating system rarely gets infected by viruses, and therefore the Department of Education should only purchase Mac computers, yes or no? That's a leading question. The information in the question is leading to give a particular answers. Question 4, which of the following federal programs do you feel are the most effective in assisting students to succeed? Here there are too many acronyms without any definition. And finally, the last question is, how do you feel about the instructors in your course? It's unlikely that you would ask for such sensitive information. Question 6 is an example of something that we've seen before, which is the use of a double negative. Question 7 asks, which of the following are types of questions that can be used in surveys? And there are too many options in this question. So there are many things to avoid in creating a questionnaire, for example, double negatives, inappropriate question forms, leading or loaded questions, sensitive issues, and so on, questions that are too complex, questions that are ambiguous or vague, or questions that contain jargon or technical language. Let's have a review question about closed-ended questions. These most commonly take the form of multiple choice questions where respondents choose from a set list of answers. So which of the following is a disadvantage of using closed questions in a survey? Is it A, it makes answers easier for the researchers to process and analyse. B, it minimises the risk of variability in the way answers are recorded. C, they prevent respondents from giving spontaneous, unexpected answers. Or D, closed questions are quicker and easier for respondents to complete. So which one is a disadvantage of closed questions? The answer to this question is C. The clear advantage of closed questions lies in their very nature. They do not permit spontaneity. Closed questions are indeed quicker and easier for respondents to complete, making this a real advantage for this type of question over open-ended questions. If the questions have been pre-coded, the responses are easier to process and analyze, making this another advantage. Furthermore, since interviewers may record what they think that respondents mean by particular answers, closed questions tend to reduce the possibility of variability of what is actually recorded. This review question asks, which of the following is a disadvantage of self-completion questionnaires compared to structured interviews? Is it A, the researcher cannot use other research methods with this approach? B, the researcher cannot ask many open-ended questions. C, the respondent may critique the research design of the questionnaire. Or D, the respondent can withdraw from the study. This question asked, which of the following is a disadvantage of self-completion questionnaires compared to structured interviews? And the answer is B. In a self-completion questionnaire, the researcher cannot ask many open-ended questions. So this is one of the limitations of self-completion questionnaire. It is true that eliminating the interview eliminates interviewer bias, but it is also true that no follow-up questions can be asked. Researchers often set closed-ended questionnaires in this type of questionnaire because open-ended questions may cause problems of interpretation as well as proving too tedious to complete. In this slide, we'll look at some of the key things to consider when designing surveys. Firstly, the mode of data collection. When you're gathering data through phone surveys or in-person interviews, the interviewer's words and actions will have a major impact on your final results. Online surveys, on the other hand, rely heavily on the question wording and design. You won't have the benefit of inflection or body language to help you to convey the question's meanings. Phrasings, colour choice and layouts will all play major roles in how respondents interpret your questions. It's also important to have a clear questions structure. Survey questions have 3 distinct parts and each must work in harmony with the others to capture good data. The 3 things are the question stem, for example, what is your age? Additional instructions, for example, select one answer, and the response options available, for example, different age categories. The wrong combinations can leave respondents confused about how to answer the question, and this can lead to confused survey results. Secondly, is the visual survey design. The verbal part of your study is crucial, but if you're using survey designs in an inconsistent way, you can increase the burden on your respondents and prevent them from fully understanding your survey's meaning. As we saw in the previous example of the appalling questionnaire, using different font size and colours and so on forces the respondent to relearn their meaning each time they're used. Also presenting scale questions with different directions, for example, positive to negative or negative to positive, can also increase measurements error. Respondents may assume that all rating questions have the same scale direction, even if individual question instructions explain the meaning of the scale's endpoints. So there are a number of things to consider when designing a questionnaire. The next important factor is the accuracy of the answers you receive. Most people don't have a flawless memory. Regardless of their intentions, respondents will not always be able to provide you with accurate information. For example, people will answer questions about their gender and age easily, but when it comes to attitudes and opinions, they may have difficulty formulating an answer. Therefore, to get the best possible data about these subjective topics, try to use language that reflects how your respondents actually think and talk about the topic you're asking about. Questions about measured behaviour should be relevant to your respondents and capture their potential state of mind. The key is to understand what level of detail you need to achieve for the aims of your project so that you can incorporate the right blend of quantitative and qualitative questions. So let's look at an example of a survey. It's one that I've used to study a range of issues such as polypharmacy, metabolic health, and alcohol. I've used it as the basis for research proposals and student projects. The study in question is the English longitudinal study of aging, and as it's shown in the slide here, it's concerned with the health and lifestyles of people aged 50 and over, and this part of it is the self-completion questionnaire. So this questionnaire has been developed over many years. It's gone through many waves of data collection, and I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of some of the questions. This is a question and it asks, are you a member of any of these organizations, clubs or society? Tick all that apply. So remember what we talked about, the way that questions are laid out and so on, the number of choices, and this is the way that they've chosen to lay out this question here. You can see that there's it asks respondents to tick all that apply. It goes through different groups, and then at the bottom, as it says no, I am not a member of any organizations, clubs or society. So that's important to allow an option where the person can answer that option that they don't belong to any. And then there's a follow-up question. It says, thinking about all of these organizations, clubs or society that you're a member of, how many meetings or committee members do you attend in a year? If none, please answer no. So you might think, well, this isn't really an important question as such, but actually some projects have found that it is quite an important question in relation to people's health and well-being. Here's another type of question which enables us to go beyond the simple yes/no answers. In this case, the question is, how easy or difficult is it for you to get to each of the following places using your usual form of transport? So first of all, notice that the question is balanced, how easy or difficult, not just easy, in order to avoid prejudging the issues. And we can see here there's a scale going from very easy, quite difficult, and very difficult. So these four categories would be considered an example of a Likert scale, where we have a spectrum going from very easy to very difficult. In this situation, we also have two additional options, which is unable to go and do not wish to go. So it's not a straightforward Likert scale because it has these two additional categories. So in this example, we have two categories, easy and difficulty, with two levels, very easy or very difficult. Named after their creator, the American social scientist Rensis Likert. Likert scales are popular because they're considered one of the most reliable ways to measure opinions and perceptions. Compared to binary questions where you only have two answers to choose from, Likert scales give you more granular feedback. Using Likert scales in a survey can help you to uncover degrees of opinions. They can give you a deeper understanding of the issues involved. In this example, we're going to look at visual analog scales. This is a question taken from Elsa, and it says, think of the ladder as representing where people stand in our society. The top of the ladder are people who are best off, and at the bottom, people who are worst off. The higher up you are on the ladder, the closer you are to the people at the top, the closer you are to the people at the bottom. And it says, please mark a cross on the rung on the ladder where you would place yourself. So a visual analog scale is a measurement instrument that tries to measure a characteristic that is believed to range across a continuum of values that cannot be easily measured. Visual analog scales are less popular than Likert scales. However, visual analog scales seem to be more sensitive to small changes in subjective states and are not affected by the wording of the response alternative as it is in the Likert scale. The interpretation of the visual analog scale is left to the test subject. So that's the difference between the visual analog scale and the Likert scale. Let's look at another type of question that can be used in a questionnaire called a vignette. In survey research, a vignette question describes an event or circumstances or other scenario, the wording of which is controlled by the researcher. Vignettes may be used for three purposes in social research: to allow actions and context to be explored, to clarify people's judgments, and to provide a less personal and therefore less threatening way of exploring sensitive topics. The use of vignettes is supported as a means of producing more valid and more reliable measures of respondents' opinions than the simpler abstract questions more typical of opinion surveys. So here we can see an example of vignette that I and my colleagues used in a study of drug injecting behaviour in Glasgow in the 1990s from a paper called The Use of Vignettes to Study Drug Injectors' Preparedness to Share Injecting Equipment. So rather than asking the drug injectors about their own sharing of injecting of equipment, we asked them about scenarios and how would they behave in those scenarios. So one of the questions was, I want you to imagine that you are with a very good friend. You have both just scored drugs and you both have your own tools, that is injecting equipment. The two of you are in a stairwell preparing to inject, but your tools have just blocked. Would you go away and try to get a new set of works? Ask your friend if you could use his or her works, saying that you can wash them out with a bottle of water in your pocket. And this scenario could either be based on a good friend or their partner or their acquaintance. So the responses to these questions allowed us to explore how people might behave in different situations with regard to the sharing of injecting equipment. Here are some of the results of the study. 55% of those who had not borrowed equipment in the last 6 months stated that they would be prepared to borrow injecting equipment in at least one of the situations described within the vignettes. This increased to 95% in the case of those injectors who had reported borrowing in the last 6 months. For both groups, there is a statistically significant reduction in the preparedness to borrow with increased social distance. In other words, they're more likely to borrow from their partner than from an acquaintance. What these results show that is even in situations where drug injectors may have modified their behaviour in the direction of lower levels of reported sharing, a propensity to share may remain. So you can see this is one aspect of a vignette that we may not have picked up in a normal questionnaire type question. Let's have a review question about vignettes. So a vignette question, the one that asks respondents to think about A, family obligations to care for sick relatives, B, an intensely painful or sensitive issue in their personal life, C, a scenario involving imaginary characters in a realistic situation, or D, their favourite kind of salad dressing. So a vignette question is one that asks respondents to think about, and the answer is C, a scenario involving imaginary characters in a realistic situation. A vignette is like a piece of a story where a family situation might be depicted at a decision point. They are often referred to as scenarios, which are fictitious but attempt to portray real decisions in the life of real people. In an interview setting, the respondent is shown one of these scenarios and asked for their opinion on a course of action from a list of possibilities. In this way, the vignette question can be seen as another example of a closed question. Now we're going to look at Likert scales. In 1932, Likert developed the principle of measuring attitudes by asking people to respond to statements about a topic in terms of the extent to which they agree with them, and so tapped into the cognitive and affective components of attitudes. Likert-type scales use fixed choice response formats and are designed to measure attitudes, opinions. These are ordinal scales that measure levels of agreement or disagreement because we can't measure the distance between 2 points in the scale. If we look at this example here, the question is that you're asked to comment on, I believe the ecological questions are the most important issue facing human beings today, and the response categories are strongly agree, agree, don't know, disagree, and strongly agree. So the Likert scale is a very common type of way of tapping into people's attitudes about various topics. Let's have a review question about Likert scales. So why could Likert scales be criticised? Is it because they're too easy to complete? They're too qualitative, they cannot be analysed, they restrict participants' answers, they're too difficult to complete, or they have too few points on them. Likert scales could be criticised because they restrict participants' answers. So question D is the correct response. A Likert scale is one-dimensional and only gives limited options of response. Also, other criticisms are it is not unlikely that people's answers could be influenced by previous questions, or they could heavily concentrate on one response side, for example, agree or disagree. Frequently, people avoid choosing the extreme options on the scales because of the negative implications of choosing an extreme response, even if an extreme response would be the most accurate. So those are some of the limitations of Likert scales. Here's another review question about Likert scales. Which of the following could be used in a Likert scale? And you can see the list below. Utterly disagree, agree, completely agree, totally agree, neither agree or disagree, or all of the above. The answer is F. So all of these could be used in a Likert scale because they all represent different points of agreement or disagreement. So we'll end by looking at some good ideas and pitfalls when it comes to questionnaires. So good ideas are firstly to have a well-articulated research topic. If I use the example of the study that I and my colleagues did in Glasgow many years ago, looking at drug use and methadone, you can see that the questionnaire contains a number of sections, each of which required quite a lot of work to understand all the issues involved and come up with good questions. And this was a a face-to-face survey, so we had to consider the choice of survey format. We had to develop a clear questionnaire with good signposting, and we had to make sure that the questions were clear and comprehensible. So a number of good ideas, and we can see also the pitfalls on the other side here. I previously mentioned the importance of piloting, and for this questionnaire here, it was absolutely vital to do piloting to make adjustments to the questions where people maybe didn't understand them fully. Another key point was in terms of the sampling, to make sure that we interviewed people both in treatment and non-treatment settings, so that we would get a good cross-section of people and wouldn't disenfranchise certain groups. We also interviewed at different locations and at different times to try to maximise the update. With regard to free text boxes, this is something that we didn't do in our questionnaire. As it says here, this can take many hours of analysis, and we already had many questions, so we didn't feel that that was necessary. So I hope this session on questionnaire design has given you an overview of some of the issues involved in this topic.